Good afternoon and welcome to the Ohio Department of Education Social Studies Meetup. My name is Kara Patinsky. I'm the ELA consultant at ODE, and it is my extreme honor to be able to begin this webinar with you. A few ground rules that we need to go over. We're asking that you stay engaged. You will experience discomfort, and it's okay. You need to experience that. You need to speak your truth. Assume positive intention with your colleagues that are around you. And you need to expect and accept that you're not going to get closure in this one session. This is a type of work that takes a long time to work through, so you do need to be comfortable with that feeling of non-closure. If you have any questions, we ask that you put it in the chat, and that chat will be monitored. So myself and another one of our ODE consultants will be monitoring the chat for questions or concerns throughout. So I will be introducing our speaker for today. Dr. Cynthia Tyson comes to us from the Ohio State University, and this has been her life's work and her life's path. So today, this session will be teaching about racism, assembling a teacher's toolkit. We do have a previous session that Dr. Tyson did with us that will be available on ODE's website. So without any further ado, I will hand this over to Dr. Tyson.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone who has joined us. We appreciate you being here and knowing that this hour of the day, there's a lot of other places and things you probably could be doing, but you're here, and for that we are grateful. Today's topic is teaching about racism, assembling a teacher's toolkit. And I want to start off by saying that this is not going to necessarily be an hour where you will walk away with everything you possibly need to be a great teacher on this topic of race or racism. This is not necessarily an add water and you've got all the best practices there. While I will share a couple of examples, a couple models, and a couple exemplars for you to take a look at, this is more about shifting and changing yourself as well as your students and even maybe sometimes the parents and community that you're working with to being more open, more responsive, so that your curriculum is relevant to the things that we see happening culturally today. So let's just jump right in. Here's a short outline for the three major topics that we will be discussing today. I'll start off with some developmental considerations. Then I'll share a framework to help teach about race, one that has been used by many educators and is now seen as a best practice, and give you some research and some things around that. And then teaching about race, a very concrete example using a piece of children's literature. So let's start off with developmental considerations. One of the things that we hear often, and I hear often in my work, is folks saying, well, you know, do children really think about race? Do they notice it? Are they too young? At what point should we have these conversations? And all the research supports that children do notice it, they think about it. Often as adults, we're the ones that are worrying about it. But if we don't talk about it, then racial bias happens in ways that we don't anticipate or that we wouldn't necessarily want to facilitate. So like the third bullet here states, silence about race reinforces racism by letting children draw their own conclusions based on what they see. And I think all of you would agree with me that right now we are seeing lots of things that need to be negotiated and mediated through discussion and discourse. We don't want children just seeing what's unfolding in the world today across two pandemics, that of COVID-19 and that of racial injustice. We want them to be able to be facilitated to making decisions that are not just reactionary or full of misinformation, but being able to expand their knowledge base, to become participatory as citizens, because we know that's the bottom line of what we want with social studies. And so as teachers and even families who are also our partners in this endeavor can play a very powerful role in helping children of all ages, even from very young children, develop a positive attitude about race, and then be able to promote a more just future. I was going to say webinar, but the presentation that I gave the last time it's in the chat, I believe, takes you a little bit deeper into understanding terms and definitions and sort of doing a more foundational piece. So I encourage you to also go back to that one because you'll be able to really see foundationally some things you need to think about. So let's think about teacher musings here. Again, as we know that children already, they're okay, but sometimes people believe that it's too sensitive or too complex for their students. Or they fear, oh, I may say the wrong thing, and oh, I may be labeled that dreaded word, a racist. In many instances, we are just speaking a really different racial language based on our experiences. And then that's what causes the confusion, and that's what gets in the way of our understanding. Your students have some experiences and have some racialized experiences, and you have some that may be different. We see this across culture, we see this across ethnicities, we see this across if there's difference in language. The same thing can be true when we have people who are marked racially different. And we argue that one of the reasons why social studies teachers feel this way is because there really is a lack of a common racial literacy, which I'll talk about a little later. Now, don't get me wrong, we know that educators and many educators that I've run across in my work really want to create a respectful classroom. They want environments where they can talk about these controversial issues, tie them to the objectives that they're teaching, and have very lively discussions. But along with those lively discussions often come emotions. And if we look at current events, especially our current events at this time that are related to race, there are very high tensions, emotions, even polarization in their families and between communities. And this is especially true for students of color. And so often when faced with that type of a dilemma, with all of the challenges that you already have in the classroom, then you may make a decision, you know what, I'm just going to avoid the discussion. I'm just going to not engage in it at all. And one of the things that we know, not only from the research, but also from our own teaching, and I can say from my own teaching experience, that what it then becomes is the elephant in the middle of the room. And we know that that only gets ignored for so long. So today I want to talk about the framework to teach about race and its racial literacies. This has been in the literature some by multiple people. It's really about exploring race and other controversial issues in a civil and productive manner, which we'll talk about what that is, that really develops the students' racial literacies and equips them to be proactive citizens in a democratic society. We live in a constitutional democratic society. We want our students to grow up being able to be proactive versus reactive in ways, because sometimes reactive responses are not going to push us to a place for greater understanding, especially across races. Now, while it talks about developing students' racial literacies, this is a simultaneous experience, because as your students' racial literacies develop, then you as a teacher, your racial literacy will also develop. There's a saying that says, you know, the best teacher is, you know, it's a window to your own understanding. Well, this is one of those situations where as you begin to understand more about how you are marked racially, how you have developed a literacy around what it means to live in a constitutional democratic society around race, that the same thing simultaneously would be happening with you and your students. So now let's really look at the 4 major pieces around racial literacy. Racial literacy understands a few things. First of all, it's a socially constructed concept. It's not biological. It's set up to govern or control people on the basis of the color of their skin. And then the capacity to sort of conjugate the grammar of race, which, those English terms can help us here, in different contexts and circumstances. So race was a made-up thing. I don't have time in this presentation to take us through all of the history, but I encourage you to take a look at a PBS series that's called Race, the Power of an Illusion. And it takes us historically through understanding how race was marked, how it was marked with policies and laws and socially constructed, and it has nothing to do with biology, even though there were attempts for many years to connect it to biology. Being able to look at race within its different contexts and the different circumstances that presents itself, then that's what literacy is. It's sort of like the same thing as with, our reading. When you learn particular skills for reading and understanding, inferencing and comprehension skills, you can apply them to all the different texts that you read. Racial literacy is the same thing in that you will be able to apply the kinds of skills that you get into the different contexts and the different circumstances, no matter what they may be. So let's talk about the steps. The first step involves really defining race and racism, not conflating the two, because sometimes that happens. Again, race is socially constructed. It's a concept. It was an idea. It was introduced into society. It is not a real thing. It's not biological. It was set up, again, to govern or control people on the basis of their skin color. But what's really important about understanding racism is that while it may be racism as a byproduct of race is an invented concept, the impact it has on people's lives is real. Those who are impacted by the social constructs, the thoughts, the actions, the systems that are created to oppress some groups and privilege other groups, those things are real. And that's why we have to deal with them, not only in our society, but in the microcosm of society in our classrooms. Because even though it's not a real thing as it is socially constructed, its reality as experienced is. The next step to look at is understanding that racism is more than the simple acts of individual prejudice. As I mentioned earlier, when people think, oh, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to deal with it, I don't want to be called, quote unquote, a racist, that's reducing it to the individual. Now, yes, there are some actions on the part of individuals that are racist, and they are born of prejudice and stereotypes. But racism is more than that. It's a systemic belief in maintaining institutional power. Beverly Tatum, who wrote a really wonderful book entitled Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? She points out that racism is a combination of prejudice plus power. You must have power in order for there to be prejudice that can have an impact on someone's life. And so the key to racial literacy really rests in understanding that, having an awareness of that is just simply not individuals. So an example might be when people would say, well, there's a few bad apples, like when we talk about the police force. Yes, there may be some individuals who behave badly, but there's also a system in place that is institutional and that is structural that keeps some of those things in place. That's policies and laws and practice that even if you removed all the individuals, you would still have the issue. Again, I refer you back to the first presentation where there's a video that you can look at that really breaks down just what is systemic racism and the different ways that it impacts our lives. The next step to think about is that when you're achieving racial literacy, it enables people to understand the way race is defined and that it can change, that it's highly malleable based on geographic and historical considerations. So what it means to experience race in Central Ohio is not the same as it is in Georgia. It's not the same as it is in Colorado. It's not the same as it is in California or Canada or South Africa. So the geographic location has a lot to do with, again, that context that I talked about. Racism enacts in different ways, although there's some similarities. And then there's also the history. So as social studies people, we know how many of these states that make up the United States came to be. And when we look at the ways in which those histories emerge, there's some historical considerations that have an impact on the way that race and racism became what it is. We know in the South, there were enslaved Africans. That doesn't mean that it didn't have some impact in the North, but in the North, we might have had Northern sympathizers. When we talk about the impact that it has on the West, well, that whole westward movement, there's yet again all of those historical considerations that had an impact on the ways that laws, policies, and practices were enacted in racial ways. So racial literacy, again, I take you back to the learning how to read. So if I'm reading fiction, nonfiction, contemporary realistic fiction, science fiction, a math book, a social studies book, all of those literacy events require different kinds of skills. Racial literacy will help you and me figure out what the context is calling for, geographically what has happened, historically what is happening, societally what is happening. And so now what part of this literacy skill do I need to not only make sense of it and to understand it, but to also be proactive, especially in my classroom teaching. The fourth step here is that it involves taking the definition we had before. And so I will throw this out, I don't think I said it before, that racism is a very simple definition that Beverly Tatum uses, and I borrow this from her work, that racism is a system of advantages and disadvantages based on race. That's it. Who has the advantage? Who has the disadvantage? How is it enacted? Maybe individually, but also within the system. And so if we take that definition, then we begin to understand that the intersections of power and race are really, really powerful. You know, sometimes I've had people ask me the question, well, can Black people be racist? You know, can Asian people be racist? Or other people that they feel might have had some, indigenous people, for an example, had some oppression. And the question that you should ask yourself is, in whatever situation that question is being asked, who has the power? And where is the power? Because if there is no power to enact and withhold or to privilege another person, then that person is not able to be racist, or whatever is happening is not racist. The second piece of this is understanding that you must be able to locate and analyze racial systems. So for me, this is about calling a thing a thing. When you see something that is racialized, when you see something that is racist, that is a part of the system, then you have to be able to identify it, locate it, and then analyze it to figure out what's happening and what impact it's having not only on your life, but those around you. And this is also vocabulary, you know, going back to the grammar piece, understanding the language, because there's all sorts of racial discourses that are happening out there. People use the word white supremacy. Do you understand what that means? Anti-Blackness, what is that about? Racialization, racial identity, and I would say versus ethnic identity. What does it mean to have intersectionality? These are all the vocabularies around race and racism that would make you racially literate. Understanding, for an example, intersectionality. So yes, I may be Black, but I'm also a woman. I'm college educated. I live in a suburb. I mean, when you look at all of the things that make me who I am, a wife, a godmother, a dog owner, all of those things make up all of who I am. And at different places in my life, I find myself at an intersection where I'm impacted by more than one thing at a time. So if you think about driving a car, right, when you're in the middle of an intersection, you're not really any one place, but you're being impacted by all that's around you. You're in more than one space. So intersectionality would be important as just an example of one of those vocabularies around racial discourse. And then being able to differentiate between terms such as ethnicity, nationality, discrimination, prejudice, stereotyping. You know, stereotyping is one that is, I can give you a good example. For an example, if you get a little bit of knowledge or fact that might be true about some people in a group and apply it to everyone in the group. So an example I often use with my students is, how many of you have, and I can't see, you can't see me, but so I won't ask you to raise your hand, but how many of you have ever heard that when a woman is pregnant, she might crave pickles, right? We know pickles and ice cream, it's in the stories, it's in movies. Even Vlasic dill pickles, right? They have a stork on there, and the stork is supposed to bring the babies, you know, that whole thing. But if I take that little bit of information that it's probably true for some people, but if I take that same bit of information and say all expectant mothers crave pickles, now I'm stereotyping all of them rather than to say that some, or to wait and see what my experience with those people might be. So if I'm making a spread for lunch for someone who's an expectant mother, I won't just assume that she wants a plate of pickles. And because I can't cook, that probably would be all she'd get. But you get my point there, that we want to create a relationship, create an experience, and use that as our information touch point rather than stereotyping across a whole group. The fifth step, and this is the ability to read, recast, and resolve any racially stressful situation. This whole idea that if students and teachers together can learn to see a racial moment, to see a racialized moment, to understand that, I'm looking at something that's happening here, and this could very well be because of my race or the student's race or whatever that marker might be, and I don't, whatever that might be. But when the next thing is to think about, okay, so then you recast it, do something about it, and then leave with a greater understanding of how complex it might be. Reading it, seeing it, knowing it, recasting it, asking yourself the questions, well, what's going on here? Who's benefiting from this? Who's privileged here? Who's advantaged? Who's disadvantaged? And in this really stressful situation, how can we leave with a better understanding? And I may not always resolve it. It may be that we walk away agreeing to disagree, but in that same time, we've been able to at least communicate to a place of mutual understanding. So let's talk about racial literacy for social studies teachers. And it really is going to involve the ability to understand and recognize how race connects to our curriculum, even when it's not explicit. Remembering that race always matters. And the reason why race always matters is because in these United States, the Constitution, the democracy on which we lay all of our foundation was built upon the whole system of chattel enslavement of Africans, the divestment of land and liberty for indigenous populations. So race is connected to everything even when we're not explicitly just teaching about enslavement or we're just teaching about the civil rights movement. It's a part of every part of our curriculum because it's just woven into the fabric of who we are. It also means that you want to implement the appropriate pedagogies for racial topics, which we'll talk about later. You know, you can't just stand up one day and say, all right, I am going to use a KWL chart today and we're going to talk about race because that might not be the appropriate pedagogy for talking about racial topics, whatever that topic might be. It may mean that we need to engage some other pedagogy, some other strategies. You know, when we think about a toolkit, and one of the reasons why I love the topic, the title of the talk, was because in a toolkit, you have all kinds of things and you don't decide what it is you're going to use and what you're going to need until you figure out the job. My dad used to always say, if you have the right tool for the job that you're doing, it makes the job easier. So if I was trying to take my shoe and hit a nail into the wall, he would say, you know, a hammer would really be much better for that. And then you begin to learn, or screwdrivers is another one. Who knew there were like 25 different kinds of screwdrivers? But we learn that if we have the right tool, then it does make the job easier. The same thing is going to be true for racial literacy and discussion, teaching, and learning about racialized topics. If you have the right pedagogy, the right strategy, it's not going to be easy, but it will make it possible for you to have greater success, which again, the success is walking away with an understanding, not only for yourself, but also for your students, that then propels us to be proactive. And the last one is to exhibit action in a civilly responsible manner. Now, this is a tricky one because all the racial literacy folks in the literature talk about this whole idea that what does it mean to be civically responsible? What it means for me might not be the same thing it means for you. My action may not be an action that you would take, but what racial literacy allows us to do is it allows us to get the tools that we need so that we can have discourse, so that we can build understanding, so that we can have cross-community, cross-racial understanding in ways that allow us to live and breathe together, really respecting each other's humanity and respecting the fact that our civic responsible manners may look different, but we can respect each other even if it means we agree to disagree. So now topics around race and racism are controversial, point blank, period. They are. Again, back to this whole idea of having a common racial literacy and then the pedagogical tools that we need, because then we can bridge the racial languages for both students and teachers. And if often when we sometimes see where there's discord around having conversation around racialized topics, we think about this polarized place. And I always want to ask the question, what do I need to build the bridge? It doesn't mean necessarily that I want to get on the other side and be where you are, or that you want to come and be on the side that I am. But we want to build this bridge of understanding so that both students and teachers will be able to walk away, or I should say engage in the classroom feeling respected, feeling valued, feeling honored for who they are and what they believe. Because when that happens, then students will walk with you because they really will believe that you have their best interest at heart. That's across all curriculum and pedagogy, and especially when there's a difference between the racial marker of the student and the teacher. So let's talk about this racial framework. And this one I'm sharing was created by my very good friend LeGarrette King and Amanda Vickery, and their work, someone that they work, Caffrey, and they have an article that was a pathway to racial literacy. And they use this framework called Let's Act, which is love and listen, educate, talk, search, analyze, conclude, and take action. So listen, the L, you're going to listen to what their knowledge is. You know, we always talk about that prior knowledge. This is a great place. If you're having a conversation about a racialized event, find out what the students know. Find out what they've experienced. You might want to do a survey or essays. Here's that KWL chart. I know some people love. I never was able to quite get that one going, but hopefully some of you out there have the expertise and have done well with it. The bottom line is you want to listen and hear what their experience and their knowledge is. The next one is educate. So we talked about a vocabulary, vocabulary activity, giving some background, using knowledge, newspapers, photographs, whatever you need to do, but get a common vocabulary around the topic. So if I say this person's a racist and my student colleague says this person's a racist, we need to have a conversation about what we mean by that, because we both might not mean the same thing. Talking, facilitating, and that should be an activity, so just pretend like that just spell checked itself and fixed it, that allows students to talk in small groups. You know, many of us do this all the time, allowing them to discuss and discuss and discuss those issues. But here's the key point, not forcing them to take a position, not forcing them to say, oh, this is, come out of this with your feet firmly planted on one side or another, which sometimes happens with debates in social studies. Search, and this is a search within themselves and within the world. So reflecting about what they think, what they feel, and this is where sometimes you tap into those emotions that can be scary, especially if the conversation gets very emotional. Students may exhibit some anger, they may exhibit all sorts of things, and that can be disconcerting when you're trying to maintain the control over a discussion. But sometimes you might want to just take a step back and let that go. You reflect why that's making you react that way. Help them do some searching and researching in that, and really put together a project that will help them to search for the answers to their questions, some solutions, and ways to stop whatever the problem is. And I'm going to give you an example of this in a little bit. Analyze. You can go deeper, and I always say children's literature is the very best way to do that. You can use political cartoons for older students. Role play is a good one, but you want to be careful with that, especially around racialized topics, because if you're not feeling 100% sure that how it's going to be perceived, not only by your students, but by their parents, the families, caregivers, and community, be careful about what you decide to role play. But the bottom line is that you want to have something that is generative, and so that they continue to ask question after question after question. It's sort of like when a 3-year-old says why. So, racialized experience, this happened in our community, this was the response, well, why? You get an answer, well, why did that happen? Historically, what do we have, what happened around that? And children's literature especially can help us get to that, and I'll share an example with you in a little bit. Finally, then conclude. Deliberation. Anytime you're able to get students to deliberate, you're getting them to think outside the box and to be aware of the fact that other people may think differently. Ask them to write a statement, or give them a statement that they can write a response to a particular proposed question, and a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Whenever we're looking at teaching about racism and looking at the ways that racialized experiences are enacting, and we see this every single day in our news, in our streets, in our communities, there aren't always right answers. I have an answer that works for me. You may have an answer that works for you. Your students may also have some answers that would not necessarily be the ones that you would select, but let's have a deliberative conversation about them so that we can understand where each of us, what our perspectives may be. And then finally, take action. A letter to the editor, creating a film, a podcast, whatever you have at your disposal, so that all of this then has a trajectory to some output that is proactive. So as we set up a safe environment, love isn't a word that we often like to use in education, especially public education. love and listening. But the best way to set up this safe environment is often storytelling. Storytelling is a very powerful way to create a classroom where a student can feel cared about and respected. In the early years of education, the elementary days, they're telling stories all the time, but not necessarily stories about what they believe about race or about racism. An example might be, we know that the 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick, his decision not to stand during the national anthem. I would suspect that from every 5-year-old to 55-year-old knows that happened. So let's talk about their feelings. What did they feel about it? What did they know about it? And you just listen. You don't have to provide a position where you fall, unless that's something that you feel comfortable about, but creating a safe space so that they can explore and discuss what those racialized issues are about. And that's a commitment then that says we love and care about these students enough to provide a space that no one else may be providing for them. When we think about enlightening and educating, so before we can really jump into these race and racialized issues, as I talked about before, we have to make sure that we have a way to have norms like mindfulness techniques to reduce stress and when tensions arise. So I've observed teachers and student teachers who have had conversations and discussions about many racialized experiences. And once the students begin to become extremely passionate about a topic and sharing views differently, then tensions can be high. Having a plan for how you are going to reduce this stress while everyone remains respectful in their discourse is something that you really need to make sure that you practice. Because sometimes in the moment, you may not know what to do, and then to just shut the conversation down really isn't going to let their students, first of all, students of color, feel cared about. And second of all, those students who are white students are not going to believe that there's a way to have these conversations that we can leave respecting and honoring the fact that people feel differently. So yes, sometimes people think about the deep breathing relaxation, that might work. Figuring out, letting kids give you a signal for when they're feeling stressed and they don't want to talk about it or they're beginning to feel angry. Those are all things you can work out in your communities of learning in ways that will help you maintain a safe space, but also reduce the stress and the tension that can be around the topic. We talked about talking. So as students begin to learn more and more about the issue, multiple perspectives, their perspective, others' perspectives, then you can really get back to that interactive activity where you're going to have them talk in small groups. And I think small groups is best here because often students who may feel threatened, students who may feel that they don't really want to talk out in front of their peers may do much better in a smaller group, and remembering they don't have to take a position yet. Because one of the things that we know about all controversial issues is at some point in our lives, we do take a stance. It may shift, it may move, but as young people, as children having these conversations, they don't have to take a stance just yet. So I talked about using Kaepernick as a topic for controversy. So if you've talked about that as a controversial issue, then giving students time to write and to critically reflect on the issue or the conversation. We know that some students are not going to talk. They're not going to share how they feel. And so writing would be a way for them to be able to deal with this controversial issue, to get some of that out. With younger students, it may be that someone acts as a scribe for them. I've seen this happen in a first grade classroom where they were buddied up with an upper grade student, and all they did was just share their feelings, and the fifth grader was only there to write down everything that they said, so that even though they were not acting as a scribe themselves, they were able to critically think about the issue and be engaged in some writing. We can provide prompts for them, or we can have them create prompts of their own. The bottom line is we want to make sure that we've created a safe space, that we've engaged them in a way that they understand that they can talk and share what they feel, and that the result in their learning is really about them being critically reflective on the issue, because that's what's going to support their growth. And then, of course, analyzing. And, we hear about Bloom's taxonomy all the time, but we know that the research supports and our classroom teacher observation and expertise supports that this is a phase where students can really unpack how race and racism operates in systems that privilege some and marginalize others. And they can do this across the spectrum. They can say that, well, for an example, going back to the example of Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem, well, that's what we see. That's the issue. But what else was happening? What else caused people to feel differently about this? What's going on behind the scenes in ways that help you get to the deeper issue? And so a book that I'd like to share that I think really helps us get to this is the book that's entitled Something Happened in Our Town. And I'm sorry that got cut off there, but there's the title for you. A Child's Story About Racial Injustice. The authors of this book dedicated it to families who have lost loved ones to racial injustice, and to those who are working for a future in which diversity is valued and celebrated. And they say this is for protectors, big and small. And so the book starts right off with a police shooting, and it starts off with like something bad happened in our town. It was on the news, on the TV, on the radio, the internet. The grown-ups didn't think the kids knew about it, but the kids in Miss Garcia's class heard some other kids talking about it, so they had questions. And so the book starts right off with something that is very much a part of our lived experience right now, a police shooting. It starts off with the perspective of the white family. So in our Let's Act, remember that whole idea about engaging and entertaining and getting multiple perspectives. And so we start off here with Emma, and she says, why did the police shoot that man? And her mother says it was a mistake. And the father says, yes, the police thought he had a gun, it was a mistake. And the sister, if you see in the far right-hand corner, says it wasn't a mistake. The cop shot him because he was Black. So here, even in this family setting, we have a young child who's asking a question because she's heard about this, she's concerned. Well, we have a child in the family, an older child who's got a totally different perspective and is sharing that. And so they begin, and then she asks questions about, well, what does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be white? And her family sort of connects the whole idea of enslavement. And this is what happened in the past. And they talk about white people. And she asks, well, who are white people? And then they share a little bit about that. And then I don't want to give away the whole story, but they are able to share from their perspective why we're in the position that we're in. And then we have the perspective of an African-American family. And this is helping kids see, okay, this is what's happening in this house, and this is what's happening over here. So this little boy just starts off by asking, can police go to jail? And his mother says, well, why do you ask? And is that white policeman who shot the Black man, will he go to jail? And the mom's response is, well, what he did was wrong. And so when we look at the depiction of the characters, for me, one of the things that's really important here is they look like kids. They don't look like little mini adults. They're asking very pointed questions that they would ask. And the father says, well, he won't go to jail. And he says, why not? Because cops stick up for each other. And then the little boy is still confused because he said, well, aren't some cops Black? And his older brother Malcolm is there as well. And he says, well, you're right, but they have a police officer who's a friend. There are many cops who are Black and white and make good choices, but you can't always depend on them to do what's right. But at the end of that conversation, his father says to him, well, you have power. And he says, yes, I have power and I'm smart. And his father says, you're right. And his mother says, and you can change people's hearts by sticking up for when someone is not treated fairly. And then he talks about how his brother then takes up for kids who are teased with that wore glasses. And then it takes us to the classroom, where there's a little boy named Omad who comes from a country far away. It doesn't say where, but he didn't know where to sit. It's his first day at school, and he's having some difficulty because he's learning English. And when he goes outside to play, the children play soccer, he's not chosen. And the children make fun of him. And then Emma and Josh act in a way, when we get to like that action to take action part, they think back to what it is that their parents said to them, and they then decide to take some action. And I won't spoil it for you. I want you to find this book and read to see exactly what they do. But this is a book that will allow you to sort of walk through all of those stages of the let's act. Because once you read it and then you're able to listen to the students, you're able to engage them in conversation. You can ask the questions that they then can be deliberate about. They don't have to decide what was right or what was wrong necessarily. They can have that conversation all the way through to determining, as children or as young people, be they middle schoolers or high schoolers, they can take action. And everyone's action is going to be different based on what's developmentally appropriate for them. So when we get to the conclusion part, which is the deliberation, which I talked about, this is where, after really spending some time studying issues at depth, students can be given an opportunity to come up with some conclusions around what they believe, if they're in that space and they're ready to do so. But the discussion is really aimed at helping them to decide on a plan of action that will address whatever the problem is, versus personalizing it and thinking that, oh, well, this is about a person versus a systemic issue. So for an example, going back to what I saw another fourth grade teacher do around the question, should Colin Kaepernick and other players who kneel during the national anthem be penalized for kneeling? We know that people have lots of feelings about that on one side or another, but understanding that, they can present what they think and what they feel about that as a racialized experience, or what it's like for those who are on the other side, who are saying this is not about race, this is about another issue, about nationality, not nationality, about standing up for the nation, for the flag. And having them determine where they might want to be. And maybe, depending on your students, you would need to know this about your group, take a vote and see what the vote comes out to be. And even if a group of students think differently, a minority of those folks think differently, this is where, as social studies folks, we can say, well, in democracies, a small group, a minority group of people can really work hard to take on an action that they don't believe is correct. And deliberation helps them understand how that can happen. Which takes me to my last one, taking action. The National Council for the Social Studies C3 Framework Inquiry Arc. If you're not familiar with that, you might want to take a look at it. It's on the website. But it gives you ways to have these conversations so that they can understand that being a member of being a citizen in a democratic society gives us ways in which we can redress not only our grievances, but we can also be engaged in action so that we can have make decisions to do things for the greater good. And yes, and then students can outline what those actions would be that would support whatever their conclusions would be. And so I wanted to share this. This was used by a fourth grade teacher, and she shared across this timeline. Of course, we know timeline is not only social studies, but also mathematics. But she asked her students to take a look at these pictures, and let's have a conversation about athletes and protest. And she taught them about Muhammad Ali, who in 1967 protested going into the Vietnam War as a conscientious objector. And then she talked about John Carlos and Tommy Smith, who, once they received their Olympic medal in 1968, raised the Black Power sign. And then in 2016, Colin Kaepernick, as a quarterback, opting to kneel during the national anthem. And then just asking the question, what led these athletes to act? What led them to make this decision? And do the athletes have a moral obligation and a right to engage in such protests? And the students begin to share their thoughts. The first thing, of course, that they realized was that 1967 seemed like a lifetime, like, wow, that was so long ago. And the teacher's like, no, it's not that long ago in my lifetime. But we can see across this timeline that protesting and asking for redress of a grievance with athletes is not something new. So here's a few things we want to remember. Whenever you're going to have conversation about racialized experiences and racism, all this research here supports build a relationship first. This is not a conversation you want to have on the first day, the first week, the first month of school. Build relationships such that when you are having these conversations that can be very emotional, come with great tension, come from experiences that have been harmful and hurtful, not only in your students' lives, but their families, their communities, have a relationship first. And then start off with low risk activities. Make sure that students feel safe expressing what it is that they want to share. Don't start off having a conversation necessarily about police shooting. Maybe you might want to start off with having a lower risk activity or conversation to just talk about, well, what does it mean when one person believes one way, another believes another, and we're sharing a space in a community? And then build on that in ways that would then, on top of the relationship, move you to more deeper activities. And once you're there, you can probe deeper on the assumptions behind whatever those questions you are. Remember, earlier in the conversation, I said the kids already know. The kids know about it. They're talking about it. They have thoughts and feelings about it. The book, Something Happened in Our Town, started off with the kids saying, we heard about this and we were talking about it in school, even though they had not talked about it with their parents yet. Using activities that start from individual reflection and then to discussion and of communities and society, starting with themselves. And I would encourage you to do the same thing. Understand from your individual standpoint, how are you feeling about these things? What is your stance on these things? How are you responding to the racialized experiences of others that you see in the media, friends that you might have, family members, or even your own experiences? Understanding what it individually for you is like will help you understand what it's like for your students and providing that space. And then go to the community and the society. We know that's a natural social studies progression. Start with families, the student, the child, their families, then their communities, then the state, then the nation, just like that sphere of influence as it moves out. Moving from a more concrete to a more abstract. What are they thinking and feeling and seeing? To then in the society, how is this racial oppression exemplifying itself? What is it rooted in? Where does it come from? Moving from difference to dominance. Remember we talked about prejudice and power, allowing them to talk about their own experiences, as I mentioned before, and then let them learn how to listen to others. One of the major things that sometimes is missing from these conversations is I have something I want to share, and so I share that, but I haven't necessarily been taught how to listen to others. And if we're going to then deal with issues of social dominance and social power, we have to first have provided a space that supports listening. And so just a couple of references, or I should say not references, but I've used these before, but where you can go for more information. This website, The Colors of Us, it's all about multicultural children's books. They have a website. You can sign up for an email. This particular one just came out where they listed 37 books that help talk about racism and discrimination. And they have multiple lists of books. I do lots of reviews for publishers, and I can tell you that many of the books, rarely do I disagree with what it is that they are recommending. And so here are multiple books from early grade, pre-K, all the way through high school, some books that can help you have that conversation. And then the other one I wanted to share is another webinar that is free that you might want to sign on for with Rethinking Schools. Rethinking Schools just published a new book called Teaching Black Lives. And the authors who are listed here are going to be talking about this new book, and this is a book that has lots of information and also some activities and the kinds of things that you might be able to, once you build that foundation of a relationship with your students, then moving into some of the activities that then support teaching about Black lives, but also more importantly, teaching about the ways that systemic racism is not good for any of us. It's not good for Black and brown people and indigenous people of color, but it also is not good for white people either. Understanding that our humanity is tied together, and in ways that once we try to take them apart, once we decide to be prejudiced or separatist or stereotypical and put power that advantages or disadvantages any other group, then all of us lose. And helping young people, helping children and our young people understand that is really important. And so with that, what are your questions?
All right, Dr. Tyson, we have a lot. All right, so I'm just going to go up from the top. Let's see here. Do you have, some people have been sharing in the chat box some sample lessons. Do you have any other ones that you recommend? I know you recommended some good books. Do you have any sample lessons also that you would recommend?
There aren't many lessons that I would recommend, because if you remember at the very beginning, I think lessons can often become recipes that we use that we don't put in the work that we need first. I think that if you build the relationships with your students, you do the work around doing your research and understanding and doing the research with your students as well around particular topics, learning from them. Remember, these kids don't come to us blank slates. I mean, we've heard that many, many times, but sometimes when we're talking about teaching about race and racism, we almost want to pretend as if they're not coming with some experiences. I learned about race and racism when I was 4 years old, visiting my grandmother in Birmingham, Alabama. So I've had a long lifetime and long history of learning about race and racism and the impact that it has on lives. So if I show up as a first grader in your classroom, a second grader, I have a lot that I can bring to the table so that we can begin the discussion. And I think the lessons themselves will come from the pedagogies and the skills and the things that you already know. Like I said, you have a toolbox. You have a toolbox already of lots of strategies for how to teach. What we need is to be able to pull out of that the things that will support our teaching about race and racism, which, as I said, can be controversial, but it's not impossible. So that being said, I think that Rethinking Schools has on their website many, many lessons. Teaching Tolerance is another website I will encourage you to take a look at. And they have multiple lesson plans, actually, that can be used across pre-K through high school.
Wonderful, thank you. The next question relates to global languages or world languages or foreign languages, have a lot of different names. And there is a lot of teaching about culture and intercultural communication within the world language classrooms right now. Do you see any connections between racism and what could be done in the world language classroom?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think the very first thing is when we talked about locating and understanding that racism is systemic. Racism is all over the globe. The United States of America does not have, is not the only place where racism is happening. And so any place where you're talking about a global language, if you do some research and you look and you see, you will find that there's a history of advantage and disadvantage based on race, advantage and disadvantage based on social class, advantage and disadvantage based on gender and gender identity. Again, getting at all of those intersections will help students understand that this is a global issue. And one of the things that I had worked with a high schooler on just recently, she is putting together a slideshow of all of the places all over the world where the Black Lives Matter protests were and uprisings were happening. And so Australia, China, I mean, every place on the whole globe, there were people who were in the street saying, you know, we are protesting the death of George Floyd. We're protesting police use of excessive force. But what she also found was that there were stories of the same kinds of things toward other groups of people all over the world. And racism then has unfortunately become a part of many societies and is enacted in ways that in all parts of the globe. And I think that would be a really exciting thing for students to take a look at.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question is how can it be taught to youngsters to not think that certain opinions or feelings are superior to another's? For instance, people often stick tightly to their convictions and give them greater value over others' opinions. And so, and this comes from a high school teacher, asks, how can I be assured that my students will walk away from a class deliberation having grown in their capacity to listen authentically to others' ideas?
That's a tough one because we know that we can't control what anybody walks away thinking. What we can be sure of is that we've provided the space to facilitate that if they leave thinking differently, they've been provided the opportunity. And if they leave thinking that what they believe is superior to others or that they are superior to others, then that's not really something that we can control. You know, one of the things that unfortunately as teachers, we really get vested in wanting to make the change, wanting to make sure that they're leaving better than when they came. And the description of better than when they came lies with us often. And so this is not the same as when they're doing mathematical thinking around equations where, okay, there's an answer that I'm looking for and it's a right answer. Unfortunately, I've seen this in my teaching, even at the university level, my students sometimes leave still believing that the white race is superior, believing that what they think and believe and have been raised with all their lives is correct. And I'm not asking them to change that. What I am asking them to do is to be open to the fact that we don't have to oppress others. We don't have to participate in the disadvantaging of others in order for us to think differently. And I think if we provide a space for nothing more than that, then we've done our job. But it is tough. We cannot be assured that they're going to leave thinking differently, but we can be sure that we provided the opportunity.
Great. That actually answered about 2 more questions right after that. Let me see here. Given that a lot of schools are going to be going online, do you have suggestions for low risk activities or community building that could be done in preparation for when we're online?
Yeah, that's going to be a tough one. One of the things that you can do is to try and find, there are websites, for an example, that allow students to, and adults to participate in like a poverty simulation, for an example. So they go on this website, and it escapes me right now, I have to find it, but they can choose who they want to be, they can choose what job they take, where they live, and they make these choices. And it's very low level. There's no blame or issue, they just sort of are experiencing these things. And then they can change it to see what changes they might make, what happens if they make those changes. I think my answer is really about interactive opportunities, of which being online, it makes it a little more challenging. Helping students participate in these kinds of conversations online is tough. And I found it to be a little difficult even myself, because one of the things that as teachers we depend on, and that's being able to kind of read the room and kind of understand when someone is disengaged, when someone might, through their body language be telling us something else. And so it's going to be a real challenge. I don't think it's impossible, but I'm really not sure what those activities might be, other than to look for interactive places where they can begin to share what they think and what they feel without judgment.
Great, thank you. The next question, does racism exist between diverse communities of color, i.e. Black and brown, Mexican, for example, Mexican, Puerto Rican, etc.?
Based on the definition that I use, and I reference the one from Beverly Tatum, which is racism is a system of advantages and disadvantages based on race, and that in order for there to be racism, you must have privilege with power, or prejudice with power. And so again, asking the question, where is the power? So if you have one Black person and another Black person who may be treating each other in ways that you might see maybe a white person treating them, or from the system, the question becomes, does that racialized group have the power and the privilege to oppress another group? Now, individually, you might see that. Remember, we want to make sure that we are not reducing racism to just the individual acts. We want to keep it at the level where we're looking at it systemically, where we're looking at it historically across all the laws and policies that created race, that then created racism because of the advantages that were given there. And so based on my definition of racism, no, it's not possible for a Black person to be racist or toward a Latinx or a Latino person, because when I look at the system of power and who is sitting in those seats of power, the privilege, the advantage, then it's not there.
Great, thank you. The next question, what is your best advice for teaching lessons on race in a school that lacks racial and ethnic diversity?
Well, you don't need racial diversity to teach these lessons, just like we are living in a society right now where the experiences of those who are living racialized experiences is coming right into our living rooms. So no one is being untouched by the things that we're seeing. The uprisings all across the nation, all across the globe. You can talk to a 5 or 6 year old and they can tell you what happened to George Floyd. You can talk to them about Colin Kaepernick and they can tell you that it's about, what it's about. And so you don't need to have any of, sometimes people think, well, I only need like multicultural books because I've got multicultural kids or diverse kids in my classroom. I would strongly suggest that because there is no diversity across race, that you are homogeneous around race, that is even more important that you provide these opportunities to have these conversations, because we are living in a systemic society for which white skin privilege is where lots of the oppression and the racism comes from. That doesn't mean that these are individuals, hear me now, that are doing these things, but there's a system in place that supports the ways in which oppression rolls out. And so I would suggest that they need to have the conversation even more so, because many times I've had colleagues say to me, once I stopped and looked around my life, I realized that I can go to work and be around some diversity. But once I come home, where I live, where I shop, where I go to church, and of course we're not doing a lot of those things now, but there were no diverse people around. And so the question is, where will those children have the opportunity to talk about those issues and talk about the ways that they see things playing out in other people's lives? And especially since they themselves one day may be in a position to enact some change.
Great, thank you. Another teacher was talking about how he or she loves the book recommendations, and they tried teaching The Hate You Give at high school and had a parent complain, and it went all the way to the board meeting. How do you advise teachers to defend these choices as relevant to parents and to the community?
Well, the thing that I always teach my student teachers is something that I learned from my teaching mentors over the years, is make sure that everything is tied to standards and objectives. And you all know that. So you determine what it is that you're teaching through whatever it is that you're, in this case, The Hate You Give, and tie it to those objectives. If we look at our social studies standards, there's something in there for all of this, and we can tie that. The second thing is, if you find that you're going to be using something that could be controversial to parents or caregivers, or something that may be controversial and cause high tension and some emotional response from your students, is to let your parents know ahead of time. Let your administrator know, let the parents know ahead of time, I'm going to be teaching this, and this is what, this is how it's going to happen, and these are the objectives that I'm teaching, and that there may be some materials that people would not determine are suitable for their child. But as long as you have administrative support to move forward, then you move forward and you teach it. I will not sit here and pretend that if you don't have administrative support that you should move forward, because we all know that there are real consequences to that. And so all of us have to choose for ourselves, which is why when I started off, I talked about racial literacy for the teacher and for the student. Where are you in this journey? My grandmother used to always say, is this the hill on which you wish to die, or do you plan to live to fight another day? So there are times when, even as a classroom teacher, I might have decided, this is not going to be worth the battle because I've got some other things that I want to do. But I was always able to support whatever I did with the standards in the curriculum. And there were times when I did not have administrative support, and there were times when I abandoned the use of a particular book or a particular concept. And there were other times where I had administrative support, and then parents were just given the option that then your child can read something else. And more often than not, when it was all said and done, their child ended up participating in the reading with everybody else. But that's a real dilemma that you have to choose based on, again, the context. Remember, racial literacy is about applying those skills to whatever the context and the circumstance may be. And you know what that will be best for your district.
Great. And I'm glad to hear you address the standards, because that was another question that came up. So your comment that this is all in the standards answers another question. Thank you. Here's one that's a little bit outside of school. I work in an upper middle class area with a primarily white and conservative voter base. I have found that this topic in movements such as Black Lives Matter is not well accepted, and I feel hesitant to have conversations about race. Any suggestions?
Well, I think that, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, if your hesitation is rooted in the real consequences that you are not prepared yourself to have to deal with, and that's not a blame, that's not me saying and sitting in judgment at all. We all live not only racialized experiences, because both white and Black is racialized and marked. We don't always talk about it, but it is. You have to determine what those consequences may be that you are willing to deal with, and they are real. If you live in an area where you are concerned that this would not be well received, but you strongly feel that it's something that you still want to teach, and you tie it to the standards and the curriculum and the learning objectives, and you're ready to deal with that, then that's, again, you reading the context with your racial literacy to determine what it is that you're going to do. Often teachers have to decide, no, can't do that here. But then there are some teachers that decide, I am going to do this here because if I don't provide this opportunity for my students, no one else will. And I've had teachers who have had to go before the board and have had to say, well, if a parent decides that they don't like the objectives for teaching how to change a decimal, a fraction into a decimal, are they allowed to raise concerns about that? And they say, well, of course not. Well, because it's supported by the objectives. Again, what are those standards? What are the objectives? But only you can make that decision. And again, the more information I have found with people who teach in those sorts of communities, the more information you give ahead of actually embarking on whatever it is, the more likely you are to allow parents and caregivers to feel as though they have some choice in the matter, that they can then opt out their child if they want to, as long as you have administrative support. So I've taught before where I've had one group of children reading one book and I've had one group of children reading another book because I can meet the standards and the objectives with both books. This particular group, though, would have a different kind of discussion versus the other group. We found this, for an example, when sex education became a part of the curriculum in the 4th grade. I remember parents who were saying, no, 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 not going to sign on for that. And other parents who said, yeah, sure, I want my child to have those conversations. So it can be tricky, but it really depends on your stance. And without judgment, you have to, know that you have to make that decision.
Great, thank you. Those are very practical, hands-on answers. Thank you. Next one's a little bit long, but it has some context. I've been thinking about bringing a book like All American Boys to my ELA classroom. However, I've been reading White Fragility, which points out that a lot of authors of color are presented as having a racial agenda, whereas white authors are presented as the norm. I worry that I would be doing that. And I also worry it would encourage my students to continue using the definition of racism as individual acts instead of systemic. What is your opinion on using literature with racial agendas in the classroom?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is, what are you using to have for the criteria for a racial agenda? And you're absolutely right. If students are reading a coming-of-age story where the protagonist is a white male and dealing with all sorts of issues around that, no one says that that's a white agenda. But if you have a Black protagonist who's male, who is dealing with all of these issues and also dealing with race, which is a part of that reality, then people will call that a racial agenda. And so again, I ask, what is the criteria for determining if a book has a race agenda, or does the book itself just include race because it is a marker of the protagonist that becomes a part of that lived experience? And I think that really kind of boils it down to making whatever that choice is. Again, books for some reason get people really upset, especially if they believe that it is propaganda and it has an agenda. And I sometimes get this even in my university classes where students will say, well, this is trying to indoctrinate me to believe about multiculturalism or diversity. And my objective is for you to be able to do X, Y, and Z. No one is telling me how to get that done. And so my academic freedom allows me to use the materials to meet the objective. Now, yes, I'm doing adult education, so that's very different. I would say that you want your students to have as wide of an experience as our society represents. If someone calls that a racialized agenda or a race agenda, then so be it. But we have to determine that we want this next generation that is coming along behind us to fully embrace all of what it means to be human and be sharing this human experience on this planet we call Earth, and being able to do that with other humans. Again, the whole goal of social studies is yes, so that we can have those who can participate in educated and informed ways in a democratic citizenry, but we also want them to do that in humane and non-oppressive ways. And as teachers, whatever it takes for us to be able to provide that for our students, then I think that we should do that, because they may not get it anyplace else.
Wonderful, thank you. Here's another question. I teach in a predominantly white school. When I teach the civil rights movement or the Civil War, the eyes of my white students always go to the students of color in the room. And I can tell at times it has caused them to feel uncomfortable or on the spot. How do you recommend navigating that?
Excuse me, that's really a great question. I think that what you have to do is set it up in ways that before you get to that, other situations. So bringing up something that would cause your students to look at kids who are tall, or kids who are short, or kids who have long hair or short hair. You know, putting other kinds of experiences in there so that when you get to something like teaching civil rights in the Civil War, it isn't now we just are going to look at these students who are Black and brown to give us those answers. This can happen, and I've experienced it my whole life in classes where, you know, teachers would look at me and say, oh, well, you tell us about X, Y, and Z, or expect me to be the expert on whatever it is, and I'm not. But if you have built the relationships in ways that help before you get there, that should be helpful, you know. So if you are to say, as I said, something that's about height, and then somebody with kids, because this is what young people do across all ages, they'll say, well, so-and-so, you're tall, tell us about, no, we're not going to do that because he can't speak for all tall people. Or, you know, should we expect that these girls in our classroom can speak for all the girls in our school, or all 10-year-olds or all 15-year-olds, so that we sort of begin to unpack that across other experiences and other markers, so that when we get to something like race, then we have learned how to unpack that and not just be looking at those who are raced in our classrooms.
Perfect, thank you. Great, wonderful answer. Okay, we have 2 minutes, so this is going to be the last question for Dr. Tyson. Do you have any advice on building a foundation on racial literacy for students who are refugees?
Yes, I think that what happens when we bring in other geographic experiences is to somehow figure out or do some research to determine what ways difference was enacted wherever they came from. So for an example, I worked with a group of teachers in Poland. And these Polish teachers were talking to me about, well, we don't really have race. We're all sort of the same race. We're all white. We're all, you know, and so then I had to look to say, well, who's marked in your society as different? Who's marked in your society as less than, and how is that marking happening? And the teachers shared, it was interesting because they immediately would say, oh, the Roma or the Gypsies. And they began to talk about how that was enacted in their lived experiences and in their communities. And so I have found the same thing to be true in Columbus. I've worked with teachers who had Somali students, and we talked about, let's talk about how difference was enacted in ways that was oppressive, that was exclusionary, that may have even been violent because that may have been their experience. And then let's talk about how the system supported that, and then make that same bridge. Remember, we're making bridges here to help them understand that that's what racism is like in the US. I have found that in every other geographic place around the world that I've done work, that starting with the difference and dominance piece helps them then be able to understand how privilege and power and racism operates here in the US.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, it is 4:30 and we do want to respect Dr. Tyson's time and everyone's time. There are lots and lots of thank yous from people who've come to both your webinars. Just can't wait for the recording for this. Thank you so much, Dr. Tyson. Your answers are just hands-on, they're very practical, they're just something that are very accessible for every teacher. So thank you very much for your time.
You are also welcome, and good luck with this online beginning of the year.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Tyson. For participants who are still on, we will post the video to on the social studies page with the link, and it will be posted on the ODE YouTube channel probably within 24 to 48 hours. And then we just posted the link for the contact hours. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you again, Dr. Tyson. We really appreciate it.